candlelight dripped from the chandeliers of Ravenswood Hall like molten gold, pooling across the parquet floor in long, trembling shadows. The orchestra's strings sighed into the opening bars of the waltz, slow, aching, inevitable. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward the Duke of Ravenswood. Alexander Harrington stood at the edge of the dance floor, tall and unyielding in black evening dress, the silver thread at his cuffs catching the light like frost. His jaw was set, his grey eyes unreadable. The ton waited for him to do what duty demanded: offer his hand to Lady Georgiana Sedgwick, daughter of the man whose loan would save Ravenswood from ruin. Instead, he turned. Miss Eleanor Beaumont stood half-hidden beside a marble column, gloved hands clasped tightly, the borrowed emerald silk of her gown whispering against the floor. She had spent the entire evening as his hostess, arranging, soothing, vanishing into the background the way a good companion should. She had not expected to be noticed. He crossed the floor in 3 measured strides. "Miss Beaumont," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear, yet loud enough that the entire room caught its breath. "Will you do me the honor?" Her hazel eyes widened. A flush climbed her throat. For one heartbeat, the world narrowed to the space between them, the scent of beeswax and hothouse roses, the distant murmur of scandal already beginning. She should refuse. She should plead a turned ankle, a sudden headache, anything to spare them both the gossip that would follow. Instead, she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm, steady, impossibly sure. The contact jolted through her like summer lightning. He led her onto the floor, and the music swelled. They turned once, twice. The room spun away. There was only the press of his palm at the small of her back, the brush of his breath against her temple, and the devastating certainty that one night had already become something neither of them could name. "Everyone is staring," she whispered, voice trembling only slightly. "Let them," he answered. His gaze never left hers. "For once, I find I do not care." And in that moment, under the moonlight that spilled through the tall windows and silvered the ballroom like a dream, Miss Eleanor Beaumont understood that she was lost. Earlier that same evening, the great clock in the entrance hall had struck 8, and Ravenswood Hall had been on the brink of disaster. Alexander had stood in the library, one hand braced on the mantel, staring into the fire as though it might devour the mountain of debts that had fallen on him with his father's death 6 months earlier. The new Duke of Ravenswood, 32, unwed, and dangerously close to ruin, had inherited an estate stripped bare by generations of careless spending. The only thing standing between Ravenswood and the auction block was Lord Sedgwick's loan, and Lord Sedgwick had made his terms clear. Host a ball worthy of the ton, prove you can still command respect, and the funds are yours. But a duke required a hostess. His mother lay ill in London. His sister was honeymooning in Italy. There was no one. His steward, Mr. Grayson, had cleared his throat. "There is Lady Agatha's companion, Your Grace, Miss Beaumont. She arrived with the Dowager yesterday. Quiet, but competent." Alexander had laughed without humour. "A companion? Grayson, I need someone who can manage 300 of the most critical tongues in England, not read novels to an old woman." Yet 20 minutes later, he had found himself in the same library, facing a woman who was neither mouse nor siren. Miss Eleanor Beaumont stood before the tall windows, evening light catching the soft brown of her hair and the calm intelligence in her hazel eyes. She wore a simple grey gown, high-necked and unadorned, yet she carried herself with the quiet grace of someone who had long ago learned that dignity cost nothing. "You require a hostess for one evening, Your Grace?" she asked, voice steady. "One evening," he confirmed. "The ball begins at 9. You will be paid handsomely. Tomorrow you return to my great-aunt's service, and this interlude is forgotten." She studied him for a moment, long enough that he felt oddly exposed. Then she inclined her head. "Very well. One evening." By 9:30, the ballroom blazed. Footmen moved like ghosts through the crush, silver trays flashing. Ellie, Alexander had already begun thinking of her that way, though he would never have admitted it, had been everywhere and nowhere. She had redirected a clumsy footman before he could spill claret down Lady Jersey's sleeve. She had coaxed the nervous violinist into tempo when the opening minuet threatened to falter. She had even managed to seat the notoriously quarrelsome Lord and Lady Pettigrew at opposite ends of the supper table without either noticing the slight. Alexander watched her from the receiving line, a strange tightness in his chest. She moved as though born to it, quiet commands, warm smiles, the perfect curtsy. When Lord Sedgwick arrived with his daughter on his arm, Ellie had been there to greet them, murmuring something that made the industrialist's stern face soften. Later, in a shadowed alcove near the terrace doors, she had saved him again. Lady Georgiana Sedgwick had cornered him, fan fluttering, eyes bright with calculation. "Your Grace, you simply must tell me about your plans for the estate. Papa says—" "Miss Beaumont," Alexander had said, relief sharp as a blade. "There you are." Ellie had appeared at his side, as though summoned by magic, a glass of lemonade in her hand. "Forgive the interruption, Lady Georgiana. His Grace asked me to remind him of the time. The fireworks are due in 10 minutes, and he wished to ensure your father had the best vantage." The debutante had retreated, lips pursed. Alexander had turned to Ellie, one brow lifted. "Fireworks?" "A small invention of mine," she admitted, the corner of her mouth curving. "I thought the gentleman might enjoy discussing gunpowder rather than marriage settlements." He had laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in months. The sound startled them both. Now, as the waltz carried them across the floor, that laughter felt like a lifetime ago. Her hand rested lightly in his, yet he felt the contact in every nerve. She smelled of lavender and something faintly sweet, like rain on roses. Her eyes lifted to his once, twice, each time widening a fraction, as though she too felt the pull. "You dance very well for a woman who claims she is merely a companion," he murmured. "I was taught by my father," she answered softly. "A vicar in Gloucestershire. He believed every young lady should know how to waltz, even if she never had occasion to do so in public." "And now you have occasion, in the most public of ways." A shadow crossed her face. "Your Grace, when this dance ends—" "It will not end," he said, the words leaving him before he could stop them. "Not tonight." The music crested. The final chord trembled in the air. They slowed, still touching, still caught in the circle of light and breath, an impossible possibility. Around them, the ton erupted into murmurs. Fans snapped open. Eyes glittered with speculation. Alexander released her hand, only to bow, deep and formal, over her gloved fingers. When he straightened, his voice was for her alone. "Thank you, Miss Beaumont. For one evening, and perhaps a little longer." She curtsied, cheeks flushed, and slipped away into the crowd before he could say more. The morning after dawned cool and silver grey. Mist clung to the rose garden like a bridal veil. Alexander had intended to pay her the promised sum, thank her, and send her back to London with his great-aunt. Instead, he found her on her knees among the trampled flower beds, sleeves rolled to her elbows, soil on her wrists. She was coaxing a broken stem back into place with a length of twine, murmuring to the plant as though it were a frightened child. He stopped at the edge of the path. "Miss Beaumont?" She startled, then rose, brushing dirt from her skirts with calm dignity. "Your Grace, I hope I did not disturb the household. The roses were badly trodden last night. I could not sleep for thinking of them." He should have scolded her for manual labour, unbecoming a guest. Instead, he found himself saying, "Stay." She blinked. "I beg your pardon?" 2 weeks, no more. My mother remains in London, and the loan papers require signatures in town. Lord Sedgwick is particular. I need someone who can manage the household while I ride to meet him. You have already proven yourself indispensable." Her lashes lowered. "My reputation will remain intact. You will be my mother's stand-in hostess, nothing more. My word on it." She studied the roses, then him. Something in her expression softened. "Very well. 2 weeks, but only until the papers are signed." He felt an absurd rush of relief. The days that followed unfolded like the slow unfurling of those same roses. Breakfasts in the morning room became a ritual. Ellie would appear precisely at 8, hair neatly pinned, a fresh muslin gown the colour of spring leaves. Alexander would already be at the table with ledgers and correspondence. They spoke of practical things, menus for the next small dinner, repairs to the East Wing, the best price for wool from the tenant farms. Yet beneath the words ran a current neither acknowledged. One morning he caught her watching him as he read a particularly vexing letter from his solicitor. Her gaze was soft, almost tender. When he looked up, she flushed and reached for the teapot. "You look tired, Your Grace," she said quietly. "Perhaps the accounts can wait until after you have eaten." He set the letter aside. "Only if you will join me in a turn about the garden afterwards. I find your company restorative." She smiled then, a small, private smile that made his chest ache. On the third day he took her riding. She confessed she was terrified of horses. He chose the gentlest mare in the stables and walked beside her the entire time, one hand on the bridle, voice low and patient. When the mare shied at a rabbit, Ellie clutched the pommel. Alexander's free hand rose instinctively to steady her waist. The touch lasted only a second. They both pretended it had not happened. Evenings were the most dangerous. After the household retired, they would meet in the library to review the next day's arrangements. Candles burned low. Once, as she leaned over a ledger to point out an error in the column of figures, her hair slipped from its pin and brushed his shoulder. He inhaled the scent of lavender and closed his eyes for the space of a heartbeat. Another night she played the pianoforte while he stood at the window, staring into the moonlit park. She chose an old Scottish ballad. He found himself singing the tenor line without thinking. Their voices twined together in the quiet room, simple and true. When the last note faded, they looked at one another across the instrument, the air between them suddenly too thin. "Miss Beaumont," he began. She stood abruptly. "It is late, Your Grace. Good night." She fled before he could finish. Week 3 bled into week 4. The loan was all but secured, yet neither of them spoke of her departure. They toured the estate together, walked the long gallery where portraits of his ancestors watched with stern approval, visited the home farm where tenant children ran to her with bunches of wildflowers. Alexander saw the boy he had once been reflected in her patience, the man he wanted to become reflected in her quiet strength. One twilight they stood on the terrace, his coat draped over her shoulders because the wind had turned chill. She had not protested when he placed it there. Her fingers brushed his as she drew the lapels closer. Neither moved away. "You once told me this was for one evening," she said softly, eyes on the darkening park. He did not answer at once. The moonlight silvered her cheek, caught in the curve of her lashes. "One evening has become rather more than I anticipated." She turned to him then. For a moment, he thought she might speak the words trembling on both their tongues. Instead, she offered a small, rueful smile. "We must be practical, Your Grace. The ton already whispers. Lady Georgiana Sedgwick has been most vocal in London." He knew the rumours. The mysterious Miss Beaumont, who had danced the final waltz with the Duke. The companion, who had somehow become indispensable. He had ignored them. Now they felt like chains. That night, alone in his study, he stared at the portrait of his father, a man who had married for passion and watched his fortune and his wife's health crumble together. Alexander had sworn never to repeat the mistake. Duty above all, a suitable wife, security for Ravenswood. Yet when he closed his eyes, he saw only Ellie's face in the moonlight. The breaking point came on a night of thunder. Rain lashed the windows of the library. Lightning bleached the room white. Ellie had come down for a book, unable to sleep. Alexander had been pacing, unable to settle. They met between the shelves, both in dressing gowns, both startled into stillness. She reached for the same volume he did. Their fingers touched. Neither withdrew. "Ellie," he said, her name at last, spoken like a prayer. She looked up, her lips parted. The air crackled with more than storm. He bent his head. She rose on her toes. Their breath mingled, warm and trembling. 1 inch. Less. The heat of her mouth was so close he could taste it. Thunder crashed directly overhead. They sprang apart as though burned. "I cannot," she whispered, voice breaking. "Not like this. Not when I have nothing to offer but scandal." He stepped back, fists clenched at his sides. "And I cannot offer you less than marriage. Yet marriage to me would drag you into debt and duty and the eyes of every gossip in England." She lifted her chin, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Then perhaps it is time I returned to Lady Agatha." The next morning, a malicious letter arrived, unsigned, postmarked from London. It suggested Miss Beaumont had been more than a hostess, that the Duke had already compromised her. Alexander read it once, jaw tight, then burned it. He found her in the stables that midnight, trunk already strapped to a hired carriage. Rain had begun again, soft and relentless. "You cannot leave like this," he said, voice rough. She turned, cloak hood fallen back, hair damp against her cheeks. "I will not stay where I am merely tolerated, Your Grace. Where duty wars with desire, and duty always wins. I have my pride, even if I have nothing else." He caught her wrist as she reached for the carriage door. "Ellie, listen to me." She waited. "I needed a hostess for 1 evening," he said, words raw. "I have needed you every evening since, every morning, every hour in between. I was a fool to think I could send you away. I love you. God help me, I love you. And if you will have a penniless duke with crumbling estates and a heart that only beats properly when you are near, then stay. Marry me, not for the ton, not for the loan, for me." Rain streamed down his face. He did not wipe it away. She stared at him for a long, shattering moment. Then she stepped into his arms, rain and tears mingling on her lashes. "Yes," she whispered against his chest. "Yes, Alexander, for the rest of my life." 6 weeks later, the chapel at Ravenswood was filled with white roses and soft candlelight. Lady Agatha wept openly. Lord Sedgwick, loan papers long since signed, stood godfather to the match with surprising good humour. The ton whispered still, but now with envy rather than malice. Alexander slid the plain gold band onto Ellie's finger and kissed her once, chastely, before the altar. Later, in the privacy of the rose garden under a full moon, he kissed her again, deeply, slowly, with all the longing of 6 weeks and 1 lifetime stored inside it. She laughed softly when they parted, forehead resting against his. "1 evening, Your Grace?" He brushed a damp curl from her temple. "The best mistake I never planned to make, Duchess. 1 year on, the same terrace overlooked the same moonlit park. The east wing had been restored. The debts were paid. Ravenswood bloomed. Ellie stood at the balustrade, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly, the other laced with her husband's. Alexander drew her back